So our first speaker will be Dr. Harry Lewis, who just introduced himself, who's a practicing therapist and teacher at the New School. He will have an hour. I'm going to tell him when 45 minutes have gone by, so maybe we can have some questions and answers. And he'll be speaking, as your program indicates, on the basic concepts of self-regulation. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. I think it's always sort of fascinating to me that you do something on self-regulation and you have a time schedule. But I mean, it's possible that that's a very good segue into looking at Neil in a sense and Reich in terms of understanding some of the nature and function of self-regulation, or what self-regulation is, which is and I will really address it in more detail as I move through my presentation, but keep in mind that the fundamental error in thinking about self-regulation and what it means is to assume it means doing whatever you feel like doing whenever you feel like doing it. And in some ways that's a fundamental misconception, particularly it would seem, if one looks at the literature and one looks at the history, probably more in terms of American response to the concepts of self-regulation than European or other areas. But certainly the idea that self-regulation is a license to do your own thing or be your own person at the moment that you feel like being it is really a misconception of the way certainly Reich and Neil and those around them began to develop this concept. Also, one thing should be made clear before we move ahead, that the term self-regulation is not unique to Reich or Neil in the sense that it's used in various ways in pathophysiology, in various kinds of biological references. Darwin at times uses the term, but the more mechanical scientific use of the term is simply a direct definition of that which is inherently self-regulated, meaning regulating its own function, without any outside or external influence, and that would be more things like histology and various types of and that becomes interesting. Formally, respiration, blood flow, various kinds of physiological functions which are self-regulating. Interesting in terms of Reich's insights and some of his ideas about self-regulation, it's worth looking at. I don't really get into it here. Probably emerged from his first insights into the fact that organisms that were lying before him, in treatment as early as the late 1920s, who should be able to regulate their normal bodily functions and normal physiological functions, were not able to do that. And this began to tie into Reich's interest in the whole process of how naturally functioning organisms become unnatural in their function, or how organisms that should self-regulate without being told how to do it somehow wind up not being able to do it even when they're urged to or helped or even allowed to. To quote Dr. Victor Sobey, it was really a simple matter of trying to figure out why human beings, or most human beings, certainly those human beings who we see in treatment or see in the panorama of people who are in trouble, why most human beings cannot do what a deer in the woods can do, which is basically go out, feed itself, deliver its babies when it has babies, and run when it's scared, and fight when it's threatened, and whatever it has to do. So in one sense, in a nutshell, that's the paradox and the problem of the issue of self-regulation. With that, the question is, what I want to do today is talk about some of the basic concepts, but is always my want is to put it in the historical context, which means to also identify, in this case, at least the three key players in the development of the concept of self-regulation as we understand it and as it impacts on our work as ergonomists or people involved in education who are influenced by Reich and Neil, and there are a few other players of importance. And this afternoon I'll talk about some of the implications of what I'm presenting this morning for what orgonomy is as a treatment, or what the implications are for treatment in general, because in a sense, the value of these insights that Reich presents, certainly in the clinical context, are useful and have influenced significantly other practices, clinical practices, particularly psychoanalysis, which Reich leaves a primary and very fundamental mark on. And actually, just as a little promo, in the fall we're going to do a big day-long colloquium with a number of leading psychoanalysts from the New York Psychoanalytic, Dr. Eric Weissner, probably Dr. John Koblenza, and a few others, and some ergonomists on the impact of Reich's work on modern psychoanalysis and the critique of modern psychoanalysis of Reich's work and whether the twain shall ever meet or where they meet, which we're trying to set it up. The problem is that everyone's very excited about it. Psychoanalysts are very excited about it until they have to actually get up publicly, and that sometimes is a little bit harder to manage. It's much easier to get ergonomists up. We're already on the outside. Okay. Let me just quickly turn off my crack barrier here so people don't.
Does that refer to addiction?
Yeah, it's definitely not self-regulating. Okay, in some ways I've begun to address the first issue, and what I'll do is when Dr. Bennett gives me the high sign, I'll leave some time, at least 10 minutes or so for questions. If there's anything that's really pressing as I go along, just let me finish the thought and then you can ask a question. But otherwise, let me just sort of move through this. Okay? I mean, the first and most common question that people come to this with is what is self-regulation? Now, this school, this is the new building, but my daughter went to the school. This school was founded by people who were, influenced by the ideas of self-regulation. This was a community, sort of co-op school originally. It's now one of the community has changed radically, to say the least, and is no longer, it's self-regulated into a very high-end private school. But that being said, in the 1950s and 60s, self-regulation was a term, and the names Neil and Summerhill, as well as Reich, would be renowned. And I teach at the New School, been there for 30 years, and ran the psychology program, and I have a sort of an ongoing poll, and every term that I start a class there, I ask if anyone has heard of A.S. Neil. And now this is a place where in the 1960s when I taught there, if I said A.S. Neil, everyone would have, it was a different edition, but they would have had, along with probably The Mass Psychology of Fascism, or maybe, no, actually more The Function of the Orgasm, because that got you more attention on the train when you were riding and reading it. But those things change. You get a lot of people at the New School now or at NYU, kids. So many of you who teach run into this who don't know who Marx was, or they think of Marx as the Marx. I really think of it as which Marx brother, So it's a different world. Well, they still know who the Marx brothers are. I guess that's an accomplishment. So anyway, the issue is what is self-regulation, and that's where the problem comes in, because to offer a specific and exact definition, in terms of physiological meaning of self-regulation is fairly easy. And when you'll see the term used in contemporary literature, particularly medical and psychological literature, it usually refers to the very simple description of self-regulatory physiological processes and function. That was not what Neal and Reich meant. And the issue of who has priority here, probably Reich is the one who introduces the concept historically of self-regulation as a central function of not only clinical practice but of social development and social involvement. Neal picked it up and used it because of his close and intense relationship with Reich. But Neal was much more interested in another concept which is central to what we're looking at, which is the concept of self-governance, okay? Which is really Neal's contribution. And both terms tend to be, if used at all, used very, very loosely and not in the context that either one of these terms was developed by the people that we're talking about. So in terms of a basic working definition that we want to use for the discussion or for the presentations today, and Dr. Bennett and Dr. Coley will have their takes on this. To work that, is to look at what we're really trying to look at is the range and function of what constitutes natural behavior in a living organism. And for Reich, that meant a living organism in a real environment, in a natural environment, and not necessarily a human organism. So for Reich, it was never a question of looking at human behavior versus amoebic behavior or the behavior of a sea otter or a whale. It was simply looking at life function. So the basic definition starts with the idea of what is natural function, what Reich often used the term, what are our roots in nature? What are the basic functions of living matter, or what he later talks about in character analysis and in function of the orgasm and in other places, the expressive language of the living, right? And fundamentally, self-regulation, as Reich is really using the term, is a description of the definition. Really, fundamentally involves essentially the description of the function of living organisms in a natural environment, or the expressive language of the living, of any living matter. Okay, and if you read in the literature, in Reich's particular character analysis, or some of the later work on cancer biopathy, he is just as comfortable, and this is often what disturbs a lot of very, very rigid mechanical scientists. He moves very freely between talking about functions of human organisms sexually and moving then to the amoeba at the same time, and then moving from that to a description of a dog or a puppy or a kitten. It really is, for Reich, it is fundamentally all part of the same issue and the same function. And to the extent that we've lost that, right, as organisms, we've lost a basic natural right, a basic natural inheritance, and that is tragic. If we were as simple as a one-celled organism, we lose it, you die. I mean, we've made it more complicated. We lose it and suffer in some way, and cause extensive suffering. And that's, in some sense, fundamental to what Reich and Neal and many others around them were trying to address. It should be kept in mind that Reich and Neal were not only popular, but the movements that they emerge out of and the movements that they helped shape were broadly based, and if we held such a conference or colloquium as today, during the 40s or even probably 50s, this room would have been packed. I would have had to buy a lot more bagels, or whatever. But that's the nature of history. Okay, so. Reich at one point talks about when I started looking for an actual definition, I somehow assumed that I hadn't looked at this for a while. I assumed I was just going to go back to one of the glossaries and it'd be a nice, simple definition. And as is typical with Reich, he tended not to define things that were central in simple, direct terms. You know, I mean, that were fundamentally, deeply embedded in what he was doing. So actually, it turns out you have to really read through to find out what he is talking about when he talks about self-regulation. And one of the interesting places where you get some of the best information is in, which is a wonderful book anyways, which you all should know about, which is Record of a Friendship, which are the letters of Reich and Neil, in which they share a great deal of thought and fairly spontaneous response to what they're both working with and how and why they're addressing certain issues. Reich talks about the natural flow of life with its ups and downs. So in one sense, and he elaborates at different times, that one of the things about self-regulation is it's not about what you do or how you do it. It's about just following the natural flow of the living with its ups and downs. I thought that's interesting. What's an ups and downs? You know, we call ups and downs feeling good, being really excited, being really expansive, and being down as being depressed and unhappy. I think central to what Reich is talking about is that it's just natural, and I think we live in a society where most individuals, certainly in American society, have real problems, particularly with the downs. You know, as if there's something fundamentally wrong about being down. You know, so what underlies that is Reich's fundamental understanding that life is about pulsation, right? The orgasm function in the most basic sense, but underlying the orgasm function, it's pulsation, expansion and contraction, up, down. And it's natural, it's fundamental, it's a flow, and provided that the flow doesn't get interfered with, and provided that the organism is capable of surrendering to both the expansion and the pleasure of the expansion, and not only tolerating but living through and processing the contractions which are absolutely necessary to maintain, you know, expansion, then you have natural function or a self-regulating organism. Usually, most people, as they become constricted, become very, very anxious both with expansion and very anxious with contraction, and often take a position one way or the other, either to moderate both extremes by somehow freezing themselves right in the middle, or choosing one position or the other. I'm going to stay always expanded, right? Or always contracted, either always anxious or always depressed. Yeah.
Just add where you're using the expansion contraction and making a parallel to the up and down, I'd suggest the up and down would be more pulsation, not pulsation, rather than expansion contraction. Because expansion and contraction would both be healthy.
Yeah. Well, I'd have to see where he says that the down would be not pulsation. That's not the reading that I've seen. He seems to talk about ups and downs pretty much in the way that I'm presenting. But I mean, it's possible that at another point, Reich has a tendency often to talk in different contexts in different ways. I've never seen that reference.
Speaking more in orgonomy in general.
Yeah. Well, it's not my. I mean, if speaking in orgonomy in general, then I would not necessarily see that as. I mean, I would see it pretty much in the context that the ups and downs are part of a various way of understanding for Reich of expansion and contraction, or pulsation.
Wouldn't ups and downs tend to refer more to the external situation?
Both.
And then how you...
No. I think it's very. Again, he doesn't give exact, reference. He is talking about how the individual living organism experiences the ups and downs, and certainly, and that's the other factor. The environment is fundamental to what ups and downs we experience. Right. So it's warmer. We have the windows open. There's noise in the street that produces an environmental circumstance which is going to affect our experience. He's aware of this, and I think we have to pay attention to that. I mean, it's easy to romanticize the deer in the woods, but the deer in the woods, if you ever watch the deer or an animal who's caught in a rainstorm, huddled under, a miserable, messy, lot of foliage, they don't look exactly expanded, so we could assume that that's a down, but part of the process. So Reich is not romantic. He doesn't mean by ups and downs just the loosey-goosey processes of life. He really means, the way the organism organizes itself, right, as it moves through a real environment, whether it's pond scum or city living. I'm not sure which is more problematic, but as such. And he also talks about the struggle of the living, right, to maintain itself at ease in every way in nature. So in one sense, he doesn't say expanded, he just says at ease. So in a sense, what he's really and what I begin to extrapolate from that is that when he talks about the organism trying to maintain itself at ease, it's to organize responses and to maintain itself effectively in response to this pulsation, and to the experience of pulsation, and to the response of the self regulating itself in relationship to the environment, and the environment's impact or attempts to respond to the self in that environment. It's a little heady, but stay with me. But more fundamental to this, and I think the key for Reich and Neil in their letters is that there's no system for this. There are fundamental principles, but there's no system. It's not, and the difficulty, and Reich talks about how hard it is for his students, right? And Neil talks about it from the perspective of the kids who were at his institution, which we would ordinarily call a school. But Neil, and we'll get to that, never referred to it as a school. It was an environment, or a living environment. But the difficulty that most of the people who respond to this is that they really can't accept the fact that this is not something that lends itself to systematic organization and systematic, control or direction. So classically, a very, she's now deceased, but a very, very fine scholar, educational and activist, social activist who had worked with Dr. Reich, who was also the wife of Victor Sobey, Francine Sobey, who had done a number of pieces on self-regulation under Reich's direction when she was young. When it came time to deal with self-regulation with her own child, was convinced she could figure out the pattern of the child's self-regulation. Dr. Sobey always used to like to point that out as an example of just how easy it is to get caught in the idea that there's a way to find the system of self-regulation, and once you do that, you're missing the point, or you've missed the boat in that sense. It simply is. So as I like to sometimes play with students, it goes back to the fundamental it is. And what it is, and it is what it is.
What is it?
Yeah, as Mel Brooks might say, it is, it simply is. Right? Woody Allen might spend more time trying to do something with it. David would be more of an expert on that. I'm Woody Allen. So it is how we express ourselves if we are free and rooted in nature. And and in one sense, there's no answer to that here. Certainly not in these lectures, at least not from my lecture. To some extent, and we'll talk about that in the discussion on clinical applications, clinical implications, to some extent what we deal with in therapeutic modalities, or what we deal with in trying to create educational or learning environments or nurturing environments, as Neil preferred to call them, child-rearing environments, is to find out, how that can happen, how we can, how that is experienced, in a free contact with nature. In one sense, the baby knows it instantaneously. And part of the problem is that, as Reich pointed out in a number of cases, the baby can't explain it. maybe can't tell you, can't communicate, directly or cognitively, certainly, with you as to what that experience is, although it lives it, okay? So, so for most, if not all of us, we experience this only in theory. And always through the experience of our armored structures, and that becomes the other key part of, not so much the definition, but understanding the basic concept or the difficulty with this concept. All the discussion, including the discussion here, including the jokes I've made, attempts at trying to root it in our natural setting, in our moment, really is through my armor, and our armor, and the armor of people who have worked with these concepts and written about these concepts, including Reich's own, struggles as well as Neil's struggles and others around them. We can idealize people like Reich or Neil and think that they somehow escaped it, but they didn't. To their credit, Reich, both in interviews that a group of us have been listening to, and in his writing, when you really get into it, fully and sensibly, is very clear about his own limitations often with this, and the limitations of those around him. We experience this in our response, our rigid responses to the environments that we live in, the social organizations, our families, schools, various kinds of work settings, and certainly periods like the 60s, although I should remind you, and it's interesting historically, that much of what we're talking about now, while resonates for those of us who were here with the 60s, it's very often shocking for students if they look historically at this to realize that in the 1890s there were already movements trying to deal with this, if not well before that, probably back to the early 1700s. We go back to the period of the Enlightenment and people like Rousseau and others, there were already examinations of this predicament. This is what I meant to mention to you and David and Wendy when we were talking about opening the windows versus air conditioning. We couldn't get the air conditioning going to the Saturday, so we decided to open the windows. But I remember it can be noisy, so bear with us. So it's not really the first. It's not so much that we come to this for the first time with Reich or Neil, that the implications of this really are rooted in what Reich talked about as liberation movements. And Reich talks about in the Sexual Revolution. Reich talks the book, which is based on two essays that Reich wrote in the late 20s and early 30s, that there really is a fundamental yearning in human life forms for liberation, for freedom, for in other ways, when we read it, the ability to self-regulate. And these movements emerge with great hope, great expectation, great desire. They usually emerge around specific, what we would call today scientific, but often philosophical or creative explosions. Certainly, with the rise of people like Marx, there was a tremendous explosion but going back to the Enlightenment, with the rise of the early Enlightenment philosophers, there was an explosion of enthusiasm, not just among intellectuals, but it spread out into the public. It produced revolutions, it produced upheavals, it produced change in social environment. With the rise of Marx, there was another. We read about Marx intellectually. What you don't look at as much is the impact on the life of most non-intellectual populations, and it changed radically. Not always for the better, but there was an explosion of expansive desire to establish a new way of organizing society and life, liberation. Certainly in the period that Reich and Neil emerged, there was one of these explosions emerging initially from the work. The real impetus was particularly the work of Freud. And often today, since it's easy, to criticize Freud and see Freud as stuck in certain types of time frames and cultural references, we miss just how liberating Freud's work was to the masses, not just the intellectuals. Its impact was primarily on intellectuals and professionals, but the impact across the Western world and probably into, I always like to point out that the first foreign translation of Freud's work was in Japanese. The Japanese translated it early, and one of the first, it might not have been the first, but one of the first international psychoanalytic institutes was established in Japan. And there is still a very active Japanese psychoanalytic establishment. It tends not to get talked about as much. I happened to have a bunch of Japanese students when I was at the New School, and began to find out more about that. But Freud's work has a profound impact, and so that brings us to the rise of this whole interest and focus on, historically, self-regulation as a generating principle for, in effect, a liberation movement or a reorganization movement, if you want to say. And here, one of the key figures, it's easy to talk about Reich and Neal, but one of the figures that almost always gets lost, except in serious scholarship, is a sort of shadowy but fascinating figure named Homer Lane. Just curious. Anyone know that name? Well, I know a few of you do. Okay, the hands that went up were a couple of scholars and a couple of students of mine who've heard me talk about him. But Homer Lane.
Oh, I thought you meant Homer Simpson.
Well, he could have. I have a suspicion that Homer Simpson is modeled after Homer. It might well be. Homer Lane is an interesting American story in a very real way. He emerges sort of from a shadow. He lived from 1875 to 1925, so he's relatively short life. But he emerges out of America, right? No clear educational background. I mean, he doesn't have. He's obviously educated, but he's not like a Harvard scholar. He's not John Dewey or someone like that. He's influenced profoundly by John Dewey. Comes out of what is known as the progressive education movement in America, the progressive psychology movement in America, but becomes totally reorganized around the advent of Freud's early work, particularly in around 1910, roughly around the time that Freud comes to America for his historical visit. Lane emerges and develops an extremely unique and typically American kind of view of psychoanalysis and how it applies to real people in real life, and particularly to young people. And he develops an idea which gets not much traction in America, but he goes to England and they love it, particularly the intellectuals. He comes to England around 1913 or so, and immediately attracts, first working as a lay psychoanalyst and then as a activist and child advocacy figure, and then as a leader in radical education in England. And this is important because this is the time when Freud's ideas on education and child rearing are beginning to have profound impact in England, particularly in Europe in general, but England in particular. And there is a whole group of extremely young and very enthusiastic, high-level writers and intellectuals and doctors and educators who become very, very attached to Freud's ideas, and Lane is the first one who organizes them and unifies these ideas with an educational model. And the particular model that he presents is a model he calls self-governance, which has its roots largely in very, very fundamental American concepts of democracy, and particularly John Dewey's concept of democracy. Dewey is a man well worth reading. We tend to ignore him far too much. On the other hand, he also wrote 95 volumes. He lived longer than any of them and kept writing on everything. But I guarantee you it's fascinating. Dr. Coley is shaking her head because she's read this stuff. If you read it, there's always something worthwhile and very interesting. And much of it has its own strange support of a lot of the ideas that Reich and Neal. So this is not something that Reich and Neal sort of invented out of thin air. This was present in and around the whole operation. And it should be kept in mind that there's so much always is right. People like Darwin and Freud, but also Marx, play a real role in shaping a lot of Freud, a lot of Reich's and Neil's interest and concerns. But Lane, basically, I'm looking at the time, and I know I'm probably going to get the buzzer soon. Lane basically does a very fascinating thing. He has a group of people, some of whom you will recognize. Among his inner circle were Christopher Isherwood and Auden, the poet, and A.S. Neil, the young A.S. Neil, who was not while he taught and was a teacher, was primarily had come to London because he had recently become renowned Scottish writer. He was the heir, and a lot of people don't realize this, in England, in Britain, Neil is the heir to J.M. Barrie, the writer of Peter Pan. He was touted as the next great Scottish literary figure. He became the toast of the town, much to his father's surprise. Neil became a teacher, as he points out, because his father didn't think he was smart enough to be a minister, or really be educated, which tells you something about what they considered the role of the teacher. And he failed as a teacher, he loves to point out, because he wasn't strict enough or vicious enough or nasty enough. So Neil comes and becomes part of the circle. What Lane did before he was brought down is start a community called the Little Commonwealth. And what he did is he was also had that kind of American sort of ingenuity. He went right to the heart of the British penal system, where there was an amazing, it's fascinating how time doesn't change. There was a huge problem with street gangs and in those days called incorrigible delinquents, street kids. And they were incarcerated in adult prisons, and it was just a major scandal. Lane went to them with a challenge. He said, give me the worst of your worst, right? And I will, at no charge to you, run an institution, and I will rehabilitate these children, these young, it was primarily men, although he did work with girls too. And they said, typical British fashion, fine, take it. Assuming it would fail. In fact, it worked phenomenally well. And the principle that he ran the program on, which was important for what we're talking about, was that the Little Commonwealth was run on the principle of self-governance. Each participant, whether they were a murderer or the rule was you couldn't be an arsonist, and that was always A.S. Neil's rule. The only children he wouldn't allow in to the institution by necessity were known arsonists, and he was always very explicit about the reason why. He said it didn't take too much sense to figure out why we can't have arsonists coming to the school.
Murder is okay.
Murder we can deal with. Arson is problematic. So, barring that, he took in really the hardest cases. The rule was every member of the community, of the Commonwealth, which included himself as well as any of the teachers or participants, had one vote. And all decisions were made communally, including decisions on discipline. And rules were established by the community for rules of operation and maintained by the community, and discipline was meted out by the community. Now, granted, it was small. I don't think it ever exceeded more than 20 or so. And interestingly, as a number of psychological tests, experiments have done over the years, it demonstrated that discipline was usually stricter and more adhered to and more maintained by the group than by having a simple authoritarian judge who meted out discipline. And adherence to the community and desire to remain within the community was so strong that there were very, very few students or participants that ever failed out. And the success rate was phenomenally high. What brought it down quite literally was a number, as things became more successful and gained more attention, there were a number of never supported allegations that Lane molested both boys and girls. In the two instances where he was brought up on charges, nothing was ever substantiated. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It was never substantiated. And later, one of the girls who was involved in the case that eventually made him flee the country admitted that she was encouraged and basically paid off to make an accusation. And she had been a known prostitute. Working as a prostitute. So this, and again, this doesn't mean that he wasn't unstable, but the interesting thing, we don't know too much. He's a fairly shadowy figure in the sense of, and the couple of biographies and stuff that have been attempted to write and written on him don't seem to amount to too much, since there's not too much. Most of what we know about him is from people that were close to him, like Isherwood or reminiscences and memoirs. Neil emerges from this, though, totally reorganized and refocused with the idea of establishing this kind of fundamental principle in education. All right? He's not the only one. Bertrand Russell and his wife established a school similarly influenced by some of these ideas, a little bit more structured, a little bit more upper class, and a little bit more proper, with a better class of students, as Neil would always say. He would always say, Russell always gets the good students. We get the bottom of the barrel. Neil always complained that it wasn't a true test of his approach, because the students that he got were only the students where parents and institutions had come to the end of the road and felt there was no hope, and anything would be, just as long as they could get rid of them. So he usually was the dumping ground. So Neil emerges out of this, and by 1936, when he meets Reich, and we'll get to that in a minute, he has already become a famous. Summerhill has been established. Neil is primarily interested in and influenced not only by Lane, but very deeply invested in psychoanalysis, and is probably doing child analysis. It's a little unclear, a little vague exactly how and what he did as a child analyst, but clearly was doing some sort of psychoanalytic work. Was somewhat influenced and had some contact with Anna Freud. And others, but he was a central figure in the intellectual elite of England and Europe. Was also very involved with not only interested in Freud, but very involved with German intellectual trends, and had heard and was reading Reich by this time. And so, as the story goes, as Neil himself says, 1936, Reich is now in Oslo. In Scandinavia, and Neil is invited to Oslo to give a series of lectures. Reads Reich, spends his time reading Reich all the way over on the boat, and he gives a lecture to not to a nice small group like this, but to a packed house, and is told just as he's starting the lecture that Wilhelm Reich is in the audience, which is like, I guess would be if, I don't know who walked in today, but someone that would give us a start. He finishes the lecture. Reich approaches him. Neil almost collapses. They spend the rest of the evening drinking and talking for hours and hours. Neil, cuts off his own therapy at that moment with the psychoanalyst he's been seeing, unknown to the psychoanalyst. Contacts Reich the next day and starts treatment, and spends a week in treatment with Reich, in which he feels that this is at the point that Reich is now doing vegetotherapy. At this point, he feels that he's gained more than he had gained ever or in any treatment. Has become starts what becomes a lifelong friendship until Reich's death, and to the very end, Neil remains deeply embedded and deeply connected to Reich's work, so much so that at one point when Summerhill was about to be published and Neil was asked to remove many of the reference to Reich, the original edition had numerous, it was really structured around Reich's ideas and work. Neil said he was going to pull the book from publication. It was only on the urging of Steig and a number of friends of Reich, since Reich was dead by that time, that Neil, allowed it to be, as long as there was a statement in the beginning that said that Reich was an important figure, he allowed it to go through, and the rest is history. But Neil remained deeply, deeply indebted to Reich, deeply, deeply connected to Reich, and one of the few people that was able to stand up to Reich and be honest with Reich. So if you read the letters, while Reich emerges clearly as the more dominant and stronger and more, emphatic of the two, Neil remains the constant, honest responder with honest questions and without being intimidated at all by Reich. Reich sees Neil clearly both as a deep and loving and valued and even-handed and honest friend, which was unusual to find. But also, from a practical point of view, Neil had something that Reich didn't have, which is he had a laboratory. And he had an opportunity in the work of Neil to see how these ideas actually operated. And Summerhill really ran, and it runs to this day, on the principles of self-governance. Right? Everyone from the janitorial staff to the head of the school has a vote. They had 3-year-olds there, they had votes. Neil was a sort of playful and sort of trickster-like figure from all accounts, and so he loved to organize the 5-year-olds, the youngest ones, the 3 to 5-year-olds, in rebellions. So, because there were meetings in which decisions would be made, and if you got enough votes, anything could be imposed. So he loved to get the 3 to 5-year-olds to vote things in that would embarrass the older kids. I'm getting the high side. So for Reich, this was a chance to see how these principles actually play. And what you get in the letters is constant information, particularly during this time, to Reich of what's going on not only with their own kids, but with the kids that Neil is working with. And Reich is able to ask questions, present ideas, suggest ideas for Neil to examine or explore or look for, and he does. And so just to finish up, I'll finish up with a quote, and also just a reminder that one of Neil's books after Summerhill, in answer to the problems that this issue of self-regulation raises, is a book called Freedom, Not License. And so one of the fundamental issues that Neil addresses, and Reich always addresses, is that when they're talking about self-regulation or freedom, right, they don't mean license. In America, it tended to be, and in American progressive education, particularly in radical education, it often became, particularly in the 60s, a thing of license. Do your own thing, baby. Let it go. The kid knows best. So just in quick anecdotal fashion, the typical example Neil would give is that of the little boy who loved to play his tin drum, and he would insist on playing it in Neil's office when Neil was trying to work. And Neil kept saying, "You can't do that. I'm trying to work." And you can't do it where other people are trying to work. It's not fair, And the kid would say, "But Neil, you said that we can do whatever we want to do, and I can play my drum." And Neil said, "You can play a drum, but not where it's interfering with other people." And the kid just kept banging away. So Neil kept saying, "If you keep doing that, I'm going to take your drum and put it up in a tree where you can't get it." And finally Neil took the drum and hung it up on a high, climbed up the tree himself and hung it up there. And the kid kept saying, "You can't do that." He said, "I can. You're not being fair. When you're ready to play it someplace where it's not going to bother anybody or where people are fine with it, you can do it." And it got worked out, and the kid eventually became a drummer. So keeping that in mind, freedom, not license. And finally, this statement from Summerhill by Neil. All right. Self-regulation implies a belief in human nature, a belief that there is not and never was original sin. Self-regulation means the right of a baby to live freely without outside authority. It means the baby feeds when it is hungry, that it becomes clean in habits only when it wants to, and that it is never stormed nor spanked, that it shall always be loved and protected. Of course, self-regulation, like any theoretical idea, is dangerous if not combined with common sense. And that's the last statement, the common sense. As Dr. Sobel used to like to say, yeah, that's fine, but as he pointed out to me when my daughter was born and we were also making plans to get new rugs for the house, he looked at me and said, "What are you, an idiot?" you're going to have a new baby who you're going to let go run free around the house, and you're going to get new rugs. You know, I said, oh, right. So is it common sense? Okay. All right. So any question, or do we have? Is there?
You have about 12 minutes.
Okay.
So keep your answers short. So we can
Okay. Yeah. Right. Thank you for reminding me.
So, I'm listening, and I'm curious if one were to put a right lens sort of informed by the things we've been talking about being the right, to the current sort of understanding out of the infant parent research, you know, the sort of micro-analytic research that looks at the role of facial recognition, facial matching, and a caregiver in the development of self-regulation or affect regulation, which is overlaps, but is clearly slightly different from what you're talking about in the development of the infant or the child, because it suggests, in my mind, a slightly different, not different, but that there is an influence
Absolutely.
in the relationship that has a profound effect on the development of physiological responding and self-regulation.
Absolutely, and actually, what you're addressing. Does everyone understand or hear? Because it's noisy. Everyone heard the question. Okay. One is and there's a tape that you can contact David Silver, who just finished the DVD of the last presentation, in which I'm not. It just happens that my presentation was on child developmental. Is that the one that? That was before. Okay. There's a tape from the Institute for Ergonomic Science in November, which has my presentation on a melding or a unifying of the work of Reich, John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, and Daniel Stern, which covers a lot of these issues. And I teach a course at the New School on attachment and on child research and child development. So I know this work very well. In fact, what you're raising is fascinating questions which Reich never had the chance fully to explore, which in the establishment of the Institute for the Study, the ORIC, you know, the Ergonomic Infant Research group, the hope of looking at how that relationship between mother and child rearing. Certainly Reich and Neal, based on the quote, and many quotes similar by Reich, would believe that it is in that central face-to-face interpersonal relationship between the mother, the primary caregiver, and the child would emerge the processes in which self-regulatory behaviors become organized. Now, the problem and the classic conundrum is that if the adult or the society, through their adults, is armored and structured in such a way, that's to some extent what's going to be organized. So Margaret Mead, for instance, did fascinating studies of Balinese mothers and children, in which, you know, considering the fact that Bali is this Pacific, very, very, you know, low impact society, it has a high rate of violence among adults, you know, very brutal violence. Fascinating. People are always shocked to discover that. But she did these she and Gregory Bateson did these it's a book, it's an astounding photographic book. I don't think it's in print anymore. Of Balinese mothers and children, in which what she pointed out was that they nurse for long periods of time, so it sounds self-regulatory. It's wonderful. Long-term, on-demand nursing, all that's in place. But yet the children are disconnected from the mothers, and they were trying to figure out why. It had nothing to do with Reich particularly, but from an anthropological perspective. And what they noticed is that mothers nurse, but what they do when they're nursing is they turn away from the baby as the baby is nursing. It's a constant dynamic that's repeatedly, it's embedded in the culture. And it produces a very, very particular response and a very particular organization of the child's early development. So these kinds of things become suggestive. Then we have no definitive, you know, evidence, but certainly things like the organization of facial response and facial recognition, and you know, eye tracking processes and various kinds of physiological responses in nursing and in early childhood interaction with in infancy definitely suggest that this is the place in which the organism becomes regulated and in which self-regulatory processes become organized. And that becomes central to explaining a lot of what Freud was trying to deal with, as well as what Reich, I think, moved ahead on in terms of understanding how much more complicated biologically this was. Is that it?
Just mention that all of these sort of sub-functions in Reich's work fall under a general thing he called contact,
Yeah.
which he defined very specifically and is absolutely essential,
Yeah.
not only in therapy, but in understanding human interaction in general, and I think self-regulation in particular.
Yeah.
Development.
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Unless you want to.
I think there was one, did someone else have?
I just
Okay,
wonder
yeah.
what stormed against in that. Is it the,
What?
it's in the quote from Neil, he said children should not be stormed.
Yeah, I think that was a Scottish, I think that was a very Scottish way of saying yelled at and intimidated and attacked, you know.
So I'm puzzled about this stuff about being at ease and exactly what you meant. when you said
You're always very particular whenever I say things like that. No, it's very good. No, that's good.
Next time I promise not to listen.
No.
You make him ill at ease.
No,
Is
he's being a good.
ease compatible with raging? Is being at ease compatible with ecstasy? In other words,
Yes.
what were you trying to get at when you talked about being at ease?
At ease would mean the easy flow of all of these processes, so it wouldn't, that's a very good question, because the implication, certainly in the post-1960s kind of, bliss, a new age bliss thing, to think that ease means like, oh yeah, man, peace. I mean by the use of the term ease, the organism free to function and follow in the sense that when I look at a weather system, it's at ease. It's not always nice or pleasant, or sometimes it's rageful. A tornado is part of the natural. I mean, maybe the term is an ill-used term, an ill-advised term because of its implications. Just as Reich felt towards the end that his big mistake was using the word sex. Even though he had a very specific meaning for it, it was just one of those words that could not play out freely or at ease in the society.
Uninhibited. With the opposite of being at ease, being controlling,
Rigid.
being
Rigid. I mean, their Reich is, their Reich, open. I think that maybe that's actually, I'll stand corrected. Maybe rather than at ease, open, that the system be open.
And then just a very small point, what's this one?
That's always what you start with, but it turns out to be
Just small
much.
points, Neil underwent psychotherapy with Homer Lane.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. That's correct. He was. That was his first analysis. That's right.
And B, what Lane established and what Neil did at Summerhill with the community voting is not an example of what Reich means by work democracy.
Well, you would be the expert on that, right?
Reich is very opposed to equating democracy with voting.
Right.
He thinks that that's a mistake.
Right.
And indeed, well, that's
Right.
yeah.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, and this Dr. Bennett can address more in greater detail and with greater expertise. Reich in the letters is very clear. Neil keeps always talking about, self-governance and voting and the kids doing this and that. And Reich says, that's okay. But what about self-regulation? And Neil keeps coming back to the issue of self-regulation as, that's interesting. I'll work on that. I'm working on that with the kids. Because Neil did therapy too, sort of. Did orgone therapy, child therapy with children, although Reich kept pushing him to do more of it. Neil kept saying, maybe, or some of it works. I'm not really that good at it. You're better at it than me. So there was a clear divide there in terms of their interest. But I think you stand absolutely correct in pointing that out. That self-governance was not an inherent part of what Reich certainly thought of as work democracy. Although Dr. Bennett is doing extensive work as to exactly what Reich meant by work democracy, which is not always as simple as we would think. Some of that is because, of course, Reich never had time to finish and fully develop a lot of these threads. Anyone else?
You said Summerhill is still in existence?
Yes. Yeah. Constantly under attack.
Who goes there now?
Who goes to that?
No, is it still criminals and pay.
No. Actually, even when Neil took it over, it didn't really follow quite the model that Lane had. It was usually Neil's greatest complaint was that it was usually the children of the rich who have been thrown out of every private school in England. Now it's a I don't know the actual population. It tends to.
Well,
Well, we were there, we
Yeah.
went there a couple of years ago on sabbatical, and they get a lot of international students now, actually, Japanese.
Yeah.
Is
And
it
part of
small?
it's
How big is the population of students?
small. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know the number.
It varies in size, and it's always been a problem in terms of, Neil complained, and I imagine they still do, that they had a hard time always finding staff, because they had limited budget, and also limited ability of people who really understood.
His
Or,
daughter's the director.
His daughter's the director, who interestingly, while he was alive, and while the school was refused to have anything to do, she ran a horse farm down the road, something. She stayed close to him, but she wanted nothing to do with the school. And the mother took it over, his last wife, and ran it until then the daughter took it over. It's periodically, up until about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, it was under attack. The government keeps trying to find ways to close it down, and they keep finding ways to. But interestingly, in a number of studies that have been done over the years, looking at the result, the big issue always Neil was asked was, how do your students do compared to other students? And Neil always would say, was very clever. He would say, they all do great. They become good truck drivers. Some of them become good farmers. Some of them become, I don't care. What they were asking, how many become doctors and lawyers. And one of the studies that was done of following through on students is that the success rate, if you measure success rate in terms of remaining stable, going on, establishing professions, getting, a high degree of success in the professions they chose, was extremely high compared to the rates in other schools. So, and this was done by actually the guy who, I don't quite ever understand this, the guy who wrote this biography of Neil, who doesn't like Neil, and definitely doesn't like Reich. What's his Jonathan Corral. But it's actually, in terms of information, the definitive biography in terms of information. But he himself did a project following up, the generations of students, hoping to prove that the school in some way was, a con job. And it turned out, he said, well, actually.
We found out later the guy was an arsonist.
Yeah, right.
Thank you
So,
very
thank
much,
you.
Dr. Lewis. We're going to take a brief break, and then Dr. Coley will begin speaking at 11:30.